Post-war 1947 Los Angeles, one murder captured the public's imagination and never let go. The death of 22-year-old Elizabeth Short, nicknamed the Black Dahlia because of her rumored Gothic appearance and dark hair and attire. Short's gruesome and unsolved murder has become ingrained as one of Hollywood's most infamous tales. Elizabeth's life was difficult since she was a young girl. Born in 1924 in Hyde Park, Massachusetts, her father, Cleo Short, moved the family around New England frequently, dipping in and out of careers from accounting to mining to real estate ventures. Elizabeth's mother, Phoebe May Sawyer, was a stay-at-home mother taking care of 5 girls. Living through the Depression and World War II, financial security eluded the Short family just when Elizabeth was becoming of age in her teens. Tragically, Elizabeth's father left in 1930. His car was found abandoned on the Charleston Bridge. It was assumed that he had taken his own life, but in late 1942, he wrote a letter home to Phoebe apologizing for deserting the family. He said he was staying in California. Elizabeth decided to stay with him. At age 18, Elizabeth moved to Vallejo, California to live with her father. She had not seen him since she was 6, and a lot has changed. They got into frequent arguments, so much so that she moved out within 60 days. During World War II, Elizabeth took a job at Camp Cook. She had aspirations and charm, but steady work never seemed to quite materialize. In the mid-1940s, Elizabeth bounced around Miami, Palm Beach, and Los Angeles, periodically visiting ex-boyfriends now out west as she tried unsuccessfully to break into modeling or acting. In 1943, Elizabeth was arrested in Santa Barbara for underage drinking. No one could imagine that the fingerprints she gave authorities that September 23, 1943 night would be the only information available to identify her and her murder 5 years later. On January 9, 1947, Elizabeth was last seen returning to her home in Los Angeles after a brief trip to San Diego with Robert Red Manley, a 25-year-old married salesman she had been dating. She reportedly had a meal with one of her sisters who was visiting from Boston and was also seen at a cocktail lounge. Elizabeth wasn't seen again until her body was discovered by Betty Bessinger, a mother, and her young daughter on the morning of January 15, 1947. At first, she thought the body was a mannequin because at the near total lack of blood, and when she realized the horror, the witness went to the nearest home to use the phone and call the police. The crime scene was absolutely horrific. Elizabeth's severely brutalized nude body had been cut clean in half and drained entirely of blood, meticulously scrubbed clean. Her body being cut in half was performed in what's called a hemicorporectomy. This is a specific way to sever the top of someone's body with the lower half with the least amount of damage. People with life-threatening conditions involving the lower half of their body will have this procedure performed to save their lives. Marks on Elizabeth's body indicated she was tied up at some point, and details made even more macabre as they were eagerly reported by the media before police had a chance to keep information close to the chest. More terrifying, Elizabeth's face has been damaged, her smile cut to create a Glasgow smile. The display of her body and lack of forensic evidence sparked theories of a psychotic killer and connections to similar crimes like Cleveland's torso murderer, though none were confirmed. Red was questioned by investigators and put through a polygraph test, which he passed. He helped the police identify Elizabeth by looking at her personal belongings. Ultimately, Elizabeth was positively identified because of her fingerprints. Over 150 suspects emerged, specifically men that Elizabeth was last seen with. Police officials, nightclub owners, businessmen in LA's seedy underworld, and those simply known to the vacant lot area. Detectives chased down numerous leads that often circled back to dead ends. The two suspects that many in online forums often point to are George Hodel and Dr. George Knowlton. To this day, the sadistic murderer remains unsolved. The identity of Short's killer, a mystery hidden in the glitz and shadows of Hollywood's golden era. Elizabeth Short's love life. While she was living with her father, she met Army Air Force officer named Matthew Michael Gordon Jr. Unfortunately, their romance was cut short by World War II as the pilot was deployed to the Indian Theater. Whilst recovering from injuries sustained in the crash, Gordon wrote to Short to propose marriage. She accepted, but never got to see her fiancé again as Gordon died in another crash just a few weeks before the end of the war. Also, in 1946, Elizabeth decided that she needed another change of scenery, so that is when she moved once more and when she had moved to Los Angeles. She worked as a waitress there and lived in a one-bedroom apartment behind a nightclub. It was alleged that she occasionally resorted to prostitution to make ends meet, although this was never proven. It is also commonly asserted that she was hoping to make it big in Hollywood as an actress, but she had no acting credits to her name. Extra, extra, read all about it. Without a doubt, the most egregious and exploitative example of journalism came courtesy of the Los Angeles Examiner, who stooped to new lows to get the scoop on Elizabeth Short's early years. Soon after her body was identified, reporters from the Examiner called up her mother before she learned that her daughter had been murdered. Instead, they told her that Elizabeth had won a beauty contest and were looking for background info on her life. Only afterwards did Mrs. Shorts find out the horrible truth about what really happened to her daughter. The investigation. The last known person to see Elizabeth Short alive was a 25-year-old salesman named Robert, aka Red, Manley, who was dating her at the time. The two had returned from a trip to San Diego on January 8th, and Manley dropped her off in front of the Baltimore Hotel in Hollywood the following day. Unsurprisingly, he was the police's first suspect and was picked up for questioning a few days after Short's body was found. Manley had previously been discharged from the Army and had been described as being mentally unstable after suffering multiple nervous breakdowns. Fortunately for him, he had a solid alibi for the time of the murder, plus he also agreed to take a lie detector test on 2 separate occasions and passed them both. Red Manley was in the clear, but the real killer was seemingly none too pleased that somebody else was getting the attention he deserved. A few days after the murder, a man reporting to be the killer called the office of the Los Angeles Examiner. Speaking with the editor, he expressed his disappointment at how the case was being presented. He also claimed that he intended to turn himself in, eventually, but wanted to let the police pursue him a bit further. Lastly, the caller promised to confirm that he was indeed the real killer by sending some of Elizabeth Short's belongings. Clearly, he was confident that unless he revealed his identity, there was no way for the authorities to discover who he was. The next day, an envelope arrived at the newspaper which contains Short's birth certificate, business cards, photographs, and an address book with the name Mark Henson written on the cover. Hansen was a nightclub owner who occasionally allowed Elizabeth to sleep at his house because she was a close friend of his girlfriend. He was also one of the last people to speak to Short and became a suspect early in the investigation. That same day, the victim's handbag and one of her shoes were found on top of a trash can a couple of miles from where her body was discovered. There were no identifying items in the purse, but Red Manley recognized it as belonging to Short. For a moment, it seemed like a pretty big mistake from an otherwise thorough and careful killer, and police got their hopes up that they could find some fingerprints. At last, they were not so fortunate. The murderer had been a bit careless, but not enough. Even though he probably never expected the handbag to be identified, he still had the forethought to wipe it down with gasoline. Receiving the envelope turned out to be the first of many communications that the killer, or at least someone claiming to be the killer, had with the media and the police. More and more letters started arriving at the office of the Los Angeles newspaper covering the Black Dahlia. Most of them were pieced together from magazines and newspaper clippings. One of them said, "I will give up Dahlia's killing if I get 10 years. Don't try to find me." He never followed up on that offer, so it's unclear if he meant it genuinely or if it was just another way to taunt the police. Lab tests revealed that these letters all used the same kind of paper and envelopes as the original package that included Elizabeth Short's belongings, so it is generally considered that they came from the killer. A new suspect. A man who is currently at the top of the suspects list for many people, George Hodel. He came to the attention of the police in 1949 when he was charged but acquitted of essaying his own daughter. He was a doctor, so he had the medical knowledge. He was suspected of involvement in the death of his secretary from a drug overdose, and he was also interviewed in 1949 in a different murder known as the Green Twig murder. At one point, police even bugged his home but couldn't obtain incriminating evidence. Hodel died in 1999, but he came back into the spotlight as a prominent suspect courtesy of his son. Steve Hodel is a retired LAPD detective who has become convinced that his father murdered Elizabeth Short all those years ago. Going through his father's belongings, he found evidence such as a personal photographs of a young woman he believes to be the aspiring actress, as well as letters from his father whose handwriting matches the letters from the killer sent to the newspaper just decades ago. Later on, Steve Hodel became a licensed PI and an author of his first book called Black Dahlia Avenger, A Genius for Murder. It was a New York Times bestseller and was nominated an MWA Edgar Award in the Best Fact category. Steve has written 4 additional books: Most Evil, a Los Angeles Times bestseller, and Black Dahlia Avenger 2, a sequel and an 8-year follow-up to his true crime investigations, and the recently published Most Evil 2, Rare Birds, in 2015. A 5th book, Black Dahlia Avenger 3, Murder as a Fine Art, was published in November 2018. His investigations, spanning 2 decades, have been featured at NBC Dateline, CBS 48 Hours, Court TV, A&E Bill Curtis, and Cold Case Files. Hi, welcome back to Cover True Crime. I'm Nathy, your host, and thank you for listening to Elizabeth Short's story. As you can tell, a lot of you have heard of Elizabeth Short, aka the Black Dahlia, and this case is now is in its 77th year, so that's about almost almost 8 decades, And it's extremely horrific, the brutality of the case and what Elizabeth Short endured, and just the fact that it still hasn't been solved. And because it's been about almost 8 decades, the fact, if the person and the perpetrator who actually did this, would they even be alive? You know, that's something you have to consider, because it's been so long that that person is probably dust. And if they truly aren't walking this earth anymore, I know I shouldn't wish this on anybody, but I hope they had a horrible, horrible life. Because the fact that someone can do that to someone, that person basically had no regard for human life, obviously. The fact that he mutilated and disrespected her remains is egregious. It's deplorable. It's gross. It's, there's no words other that can describe about that case. And what made it even worse was the news reporters and the journalists. The fact that, just to get some more information about Elizabeth, that journalists actually went to their mother's house, Phoebe, and they didn't even go to her house. They called her, and they pretended that that Elizabeth won, entry into into a pageant, just to get insights and more information about her, to write their segment inside the news. And she didn't even know her daughter had passed away yet. So how disgusting of these people. And things hasn't changed. A lot of times, not all news reporters, because a lot of them are very respectable and they make sure they get the facts and everything they need to. They don't go to such lengths like that to prey upon someone who, just had their child brutally taken from them. So that was really absurd. I didn't know that. I've heard about this case for quite some time. I'm pretty sure you heard about it. A lot of people heard of it. It's gotten more deeper, as into as far as the suspects, and internet sleuths are always trying to figure out things and come up with more information or theories as to what happened to her. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar. For instance, there was a movie that came out in 2006 based on the Black Dahlia. I believe it's called The Black Dahlia. And but it told the story of the 2 detectives at the time. And in the end, in the credits, they do tell you that the story was fictionalized. But basically, the moral of the story is about this. It was about the story of the 2 detectives, and they came across the Black Dahlia case. In that movie, they portrayed Elizabeth Short as a SEX worker. Now, it is no surprise that, as you can see, when they did a lot of investigating into the actual case, they did have to interview lots and lots of people, and more importantly, there were basically a whole bunch of males. And I believe Elizabeth was a hopeless romantic, mainly because usually when you grow up, your environment is what shapes you. And she was abandoned by her father, and I don't believe it was told in the narration, but Elizabeth was sick. She had very bad asthma, and at a young age she had to have a lung surgery. That's how bad her asthma was. And they grew up during the Great Depression, and their father did make really good money until the Great Depression area, when he decided to fake his unaliving. So he basically abandoned his family, and that does a lot of damage and is very detrimental to children that are growing up in a household, especially when you have both of your parents and that's what you're used to, and then they separate. But it just wasn't an easy separation. He She had to deal with the trauma of thinking her father unalived himself and struggle with that, to then 6 years later, her mom gets a letter in the mail. Oh, wait a minute. No, dad's alive. So then you have to reprocess. Okay, so I spent all these years grieving for my father that was here this whole time, and now you're filled with some other type of other emotions, because now the truth is he left and he abandoned you. So they often say that hurt people, but that's not always the case. But it also can shape how you grow as an individual, because we all have childhood trauma and things like that, and that was her trauma, and everyone handles it differently. And I believe, and I am no psychologist, but I struggled with my own issues and my childhood issues that I had to learn and grow up with, and I came to the conclusion of certain things that shaped me into who I was. So a lot going on now with Elizabeth, and having to endure all of these abandonment issues. She most likely never felt the love of her father. So I think, because it is a fact that Elizabeth Shore did surround herself with a lot of males, and she was always in and out of different relationships or dating and things like that. So, like I said, I think it was her upbringing that made her long for that love and that connection that she didn't get with her father. And it's just tragic, because it ultimately, I believe, led to her passing. So fast forward, the police officers and the detective did interview multiple, they said up to like 200 individuals, mostly males, and they all checked out. A lot of them, they were military men, being that it was around World War II or post World War II. But there was a couple of times she moved back and forth to areas where they were getting ready to be deployed and stuff, because she specifically wanted to find a military man. And she actually did. The first man that she ended up falling in love with, like, you can see that she didn't have much luck with her love life either. He ended up being deployed, and then he ended up in a car crash, and he got healed back to normal, to health, and went back out and passed away in the same crash that set him back and hurt him in the first place. And that was when she decided to go back to Los Angeles area to live behind in that hotel area, where ultimately led to her ending. So that's what made her case very, very difficult, because around this time there was no cell phones, electronics, things like that. There is phones, but her sister, I believe, was in the area. I don't understand, where did her sister go? Like, it doesn't state where her sister went after she had dinner with her sister. Did she not talk to her sister? Did she not tell her sister where she was going? And that's another thing that's important. To this day, you should always let someone know your whereabouts, because if, God forbid, anything happens, and you have people that are being questioned, at least someone can have an idea of where you were last seen, or where you last said you were going. So I don't think she told anyone, because if that was the case, I think we would have heard about it. And all I heard was that her sister came to visit, and they had dinner, and that was about it. She was seen at a cocktail lounge, and it wasn't even definite that was her, because they were starting to get a lot of leads that were just bogus. Like, everybody wanted to just say something, just to get into, just to go along with the whole totality of everything that was surrounding it, because it was just so gruesome. It was just, she was so beautiful, and it was just a big thing at that time. So it's like I said, it's really unfortunate, you know, her life, her past life, and growing up, and who it shaped her to be. And she really wanted to be into the spotlight. She really wanted to do big things, and ultimately she didn't get to do that. And it's just sad. And like I said, it's unfortunate that I think whoever did this to her is and was the individual that was feeding the news clippings and the envelope that had her belongings, that that submitted it to the news channel and to the detectives, because they even said that everything matched. The same envelope, the same pen, the same paper, all of that matched. And it makes you wonder, like, why would you do this to this beautiful woman? You know, she's never done anyone any harm. And but then again, there usually isn't any serial killers and people that are like this. They don't need to have a reason. It's mainly non-serial killers and non-serial killers that usually have a motive. When it comes to serial killers or crazy people like that, they don't need a motive. Sometimes they have one. It's possible maybe that she rejected one of these lovers. That's the only thing that I can think of. What do you think? Because other than that, I can't really think of a motive to do that. And they've spoken to so many people, and there wasn't really much information that was valuable that they got back. I believe I did not state too much about fast forward about the movie in 2006. It stars Josh Hartnett and some other guy, I forget. I actually just recently watched it. It's a lot of talking, it's a lot of commentary, and it doesn't satisfy you. At the end, you're like, okay, what did I just watch? One, they portray Elizabeth Short as an SEX worker, like I said, where they came across, one of the detectives came across this woman and she ran away, and it turns out that she finally, gives up some information, and times was getting hard for them two, and they both agreed to do a movie, and then they turned out to be one of those corn movies, you understand? So they portrayed her as that, and they never really did have any concrete evidence that she was that type of, had held that type of employment. But this movie also portrayed it as well, and I think it was really disgusting for them to do that, instead of showing her life and her history and her upbringing of who she was, and how she came to be who she was because of her past life. So I really did not have it was kind of tasteless to me, and the fact that it just really didn't make a whole bunch of sense. You can check it out for yourself. It's the Black Dahlia, that was out in 2006. I watched it really because I wanted to see their take on it, and I wanted to see Josh Hartnett, because Josh Hartnett was a heartthrob. Oof, in the Faculty. Yes, and in there, he's pretty quiet, and he's actually now in a new movie called Trap by M. Night Shyamalan that I want to check out. But back to the story and Elizabeth. So yes, do I believe that she could have been dipping and dabbing in that type of seedy life? I don't deny it, only because it was a time where things were tough, and she really wanted to get into the show business, and she took on several different jobs, and she, they made it clear that it just wasn't bringing in the money. And she ended up staying with friends, so she obviously couldn't afford her own living arrangements. So it's possible, but who's actually going to admit to something like that, So that's why I don't think they really had concrete evidence about that, and I don't really think they took too much time into that. But I believe it was a suspicion due to the fact of all of the men that she gentlemen that she surrounds herself with. So enough of that. There was a lot of theories into who the suspects were. George Hodel was one of the latest ones, and he was, how did she meet him? I don't think she had any associations with George Hodel. I believe he was suspected because he was a doctor, not necessarily a surgeon, but he was accused of essaying his own daughter. And one thing that the documentary that's before this that I narrated this doesn't explain is that he was acquitted, and it turned out through DNA testing years later with that daughter that was accusing him, she was actually not his blood biological daughter. Does that make it right? Absolutely not. But there is a whole bunch of documentary and things of that nature that has to do with that particular part of the story and their bloodline, and in her daughter Faye, and you know, there's a lot of things that go into that, and I wasn't going to delve too much into that. And that is the reason why they suspected him. Well, they could not find anything on him. They did bug his house and they couldn't find anything. But then after he passed away, his son Stephen was cleaning out his house, and he started finding things that his father held within the years, which is photographs that looks like Elizabeth Short and a couple of things like that. And then he actually found a recording where his father was on when the house was bugged, and it was a recorded line. I don't know if he found it in evidence, or I don't know where he got this at, because I also read it and I failed to get the exact paperwork so I can quote it. But he was saying, what if I did, quote, what if I kill Elizabeth Short? If I did, it was something to that nature. But it's just, I just didn't want to add that as concrete, because it's just not concrete. You know what I mean? It's just mixed judgment, because at one part the detectives is stating that there was never any concrete evidence and they never got anything or any recordings when his house was bugged. And then here we have Steve Hodel stating that he did find a recording when the house was bugged of his father, somewhat stating he wasn't basically saying that, and what's the word? he wasn't necessarily admitting to unaliving her. He was just like, oh yeah, they suspect that I did this and that with my secretary, like I unalived Elizabeth Short, something of that nature. So because it's misconstrued and it's just like one thing is said here and another is said here, it's just very, very confusing. And it's just unfortunate, once again, because it's been 77 years, that I think that this person, if anything, is dust. And I hope that person lived a horrible, and no, not even lived, okay? He passed away horribly, okay? Or he's going to come back in his afterlife, right back to this earth, and live horribly, I feel bad for the family and everyone that proceeded after that, from generations. And I hope one day there is an answer. I hope that someone heard something. Maybe the killer did confess. Someone knows something and it's passed down, that this family and Elizabeth does get some closure, So, yeah. Tell me what you guys think. And I appreciate you guys so much. And like, comment, subscribe if you haven't already. And I see you next week with an all new case.